The mystery of the Shroud of Turin continues today as we consider its history and its influence on some really interesting art. I'll be right back. Welcome, everybody. It is time for the Gracious Guest Show. Once again, I'm your host, Mike Creavey, coming to you from thegraciousguest.org, the Gracious Guest YouTube channel, all things Gracious Guest, where we look at the intersection of faith and culture, some mystery occasionally, like we're looking at today a little bit, and really just trying to enter more deeply into experiencing wonder and awe, being appreciative for life, looking for our Lord, and paying close attention to whenever he shows up in all sorts of little ways every single day, but sometimes in some bigger ways too, some more profound ones. So before we do anything, please make sure you subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Make sure you hit that little thumbs up down there. Also, share this video far and wide, and really appreciate all of you being here today. So I am delighted to welcome back to the show today Dr. Cheryl White, and I want to share her brief little biography here. Cheryl White, Cheryl H. White, PhD, is a professor of history at Louisiana State University in Shreveport, where she holds the endowed Hubert Humphreys Professorship. She has had a career-long interest in shroud studies, currently serves on the board of directors of the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, or STERA, and has published and presented original research from the Vatican's secret archives related to the history of the Shroud for international journals and conferences. Dr. White served as the historical consultant on the Shroud of Turin exhibit developed for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., and with Father Mangum, she has given presentations there as well as provided an internationally live-streamed presentation for the esteemed Smithsonian Institution last year. She also was able to see the shroud recently as part of a private event in Turin, which she talks about in this interview, at the invitation of the Center for the International Study of the Shroud. And so I'm thrilled to speak with Dr. White again. We really had a great chat and a lot of really interesting connections here. So you're going to see some artwork that was potentially influenced by the shroud, and you kind of take a look at it, see what you think. We talk about some of the mysteries of the history of the shroud, or the supposed history of the shroud, some of the challenges, and I do want to really sing her praises, for really giving us, I think, a really good set of considerations that we should really take seriously when it comes to talking about stuff like this, especially if we are enthusiastic about the shroud, if we are convinced that it is authentic. We still need to be cognizant that there are limitations. There's limitations to what science can really do and tell us. There's also limitations to what we can say with certainty in terms of the potential historical provenance of the shroud. What we can infer from certain things isn't always the same as what we have hard evidence of in the documentary history and that kind of stuff. So a really fun, exciting, intriguing conversation that I want to get right to here without further ado. So check out my interview with Dr. Cheryl White talking about the Mandylion, the Edessa image, the Shroud of Turin, and the art that the shroud very well may have inspired. Check it out. All right, Dr. Cheryl White, well, welcome back to the Gracious Guest Show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. And I was just talking to you before we started here. We've had, continue to have such a good response to anything shroud related whatsoever, and some requests from different viewers, different listeners to the audio podcast, and just my own, honestly, even if they weren't asking for it, my own desire to go back and have, kind of go deeper on some topics with guests we've had on before. And what I wanted to maybe start off with here is this episode I've kind of titled here, Shroud and the Mandylion / Edessa image, kind of a question mark on that. Why don't you maybe, just to kind of kick things off here, give us maybe a rough sketch of what the overall kind of claim here is for those who think that these are the same cloth, basically.
Right. Well, there is obviously we have a record of something that is being venerated as an image of Christ. Actually, you could argue, going back to the first century, if you cite, and I will, Saint Athanasius of Alexandria in a homily in 327 mentions something like this. And then, then we have obviously this image of Edessa that is related to the legend of King Abgar in Edessa, Turkey in the 6th century. There's something there that is being venerated as an image of Christ. And interestingly, all of these things have in common that these historical references to some kind of image, they all sort of disappear from the record in the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
But then this cloth that we know to be in Turin, Italy today, the provenance of which we can trace back directly to the middle of the 14th century, it appears. And so I think that part of the historical problem that we confront immediately is just how restricted we are by our vocabulary. Is
Hmm.
the image of Edessa or the Mandylion, is that the same cloth that's in Turin, Italy today? And how would we ever know that? We can't know that using the historical method in the existing documents we have. But I
Hmm.
think it's an intriguing possibility.
And so this was something that came up. I again mentioned to you before we were recording here that in trying to explain this to my high school students, and I mostly have freshmen, and I was kind of giving them a little mini unit on the shroud before we headed off to
Right.
Easter, because it, with the specific goal of, and again always bringing it back to the Catholic Church in this case, does not have an official position on the Shroud of
Yeah.
Turin, or certainly does not, officially dogmatically verify its authenticity, and leaves it up to this kind of discussion. And I got that across to them, and I said, but to meditate on this from the perspective of the fact that everything we see in this image matches precisely with the accounts we have from the Gospels of Christ's Passion. So using it as a meditation was very intriguing for them. And I tried to point out to them this issue when we were looking at the history of it, and just saying, because they weren't, I think they weren't getting it at first, or what I was trying to go with it. And I was trying to say, this thing you're looking at, and I have a replica of it, like a little, not super expensive one. I said, this, what you see here, this replica. I said, we know where this has been,
Right.
back to 1350s. I said, and then we have these stories of something that sounds, at least in some reports, very similar, that we don't have anymore, or have any record of anymore. That thing, the question is this the same as that? And they're like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I get. So I
Yeah.
really simplified it in that kind of way, but they seem to get that idea. And
Yeah.
I gave them an example of, I said, there's at least, I think, three, if I remember correctly, places that claim to have the head of John the Baptist.
Exactly.
And I said to them,
Exactly.
which
Yes.
last I checked, he only had one. So
He only had one. Yeah.
at least two of those people are wrong. Maybe all
Right.
three of them are wrong.
That's right.
you know,
That's
so that
right.
kind of thing. These are important considerations.
Right. They're important philosophical considerations for us to consider, because it all goes back to touch upon how it is we know anything. How do we come to some certainty of knowledge about anything? And it always involves a process, it always involves a method. And in my discipline of history, it involves the written record. So I am probably more than most, because I am an academic historian, I am more locked in on the idea that that if there is no historical written record, and history demands a written record in a primary source, um, then we're confronted with possibility but not certainty.
Hmm.
And so I think it's like any other academic inquiry that you would bring to bear on this cloth. It has to be done with the rigors of that particular discipline. Um, and what I have found with the shroud related to its history before the 1350s is lacking some document, some record that we don't know about. We cannot possibly link these things together in a way that approaches certainty. Now, I know I have some fine colleagues in the field of shroud studies who argue that because it is logical, it is therefore true. That the image of Edessa is the Shroud of Turin, and but when you see what we're doing is we're making a leap. And it is
Mm-hmm.
a leap that is not based on historical method, because historical
Right.
method demands that I would be able to show you a transfer, a record, a
Mm-hmm.
deed. There would be something in the record, and the record is silent. So when the record is silent, what we have to read into that is the uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
and to be open then to the discovery of new materials that might further inform those
Sure.
thoughts.
I think of something like the field of biblical studies and potential argumentation and debate, say in 1930, about certain ancient texts and the
Right,
structure of certain Old Testament texts versus, and maybe some good theories, some good connections to what we had at the time. And then you have the Dead Sea Scrolls,
right,
and so here's this monumental discovery it's pretty irrefutable once the work is really done to be like, what are these things? And then you have this window that has been such a tremendous blessing, but
yes,
you have it or you don't. Like you can't,
right.
you can't just, like you say, make that leap.
You
At
you
least with,
can't.
you might be right, but you can't state that with that certainty. I think that is an important
Right,
thing to
right.
mention.
And I do think that again, every discipline has its method of knowing. And philosophy itself, I mean, philosophy invites us into question and gives us that's where the whole field of epistemology comes from, is
Mm,
our desire to know. And so to know, we have to again invoke some sort of method. So when you do that with the shroud, what we find is that it is the first reference we have from the gospel accounts. I mean, all four gospel accounts tell us that there was a burial shroud.
mhm,
John gives us very specific detail about the shroud. And if we begin there, looking at the gospels as historical documents is challenging, but okay. Of all of them, John is an eyewitness. And so to
mhm.
me, that's very good. That's very good testimony. From a purely historical perspective, that's good testimony because he was present for all of the events of Good
Mhm.
Friday and then presumably that weekend. So we know that it's an eyewitness account he gives at the tomb. Well, think of the detail he doesn't give us. you know, he,
Right.
he he says that he saw the burial linen lying there and that he believed. So there's something
Mhm.
about the linen that made him believe, but he
Mhm.
doesn't give us any other detail. And
Right.
so, yes, we can assume if you want to go with the resurrection narrative, we can assume that, or a missing body, even if it's a missing body,
Mhm.
we could assume that the apostolic community would have had that linen.
Right.
They would have kept it. So it's interesting and there is no apostolic record of it, um, but there is an interesting reference in. I mentioned a sermon by Saint Athanasius of Alexandria in the year 327. He talks about an image of our Lord that was taken from Jerusalem to Antioch when that city fell, talking about the
Mhm.
fall of Jerusalem in the year 70.
Sure.
And that's interesting to me because then what is this he's referring to? I mean, I have to look at it and say, well, what else could it be? I mean, we don't have a record
Yeah.
of anything else like this. Um, but again, St. Athanasius doesn't give us any dimensions. He doesn't tell us it's a 14 and a half foot strip of linen cloth that
Right.
has a double image on it. He doesn't tell us any of that. So we are confronted with that challenge of matching what we want to infer about a record with the
Mm.
record itself.
And you run into issues, I imagine, with now I'm not sure exactly how he describes it in that account, but I know later accounts that describe this mysterious image, and then or the Edessa image, the Mandylion,
Right.
oftentimes as just the facial image, which I've seen very convincing arguments that, well, if you fold it and you look at the folds on the linen, which of course linen has a memory,
Right.
and we see those various folds on the shroud, so it's certainly believable hypothesis from what I've seen a couple different ways to imagine this thing's folded. I worked in a motel for many years with linens and stuff like that. Like it's not a super thick, obviously, material, so it's not very hard to fold it in a very compact way. So
Right.
I don't
That's
think that
right.
that's a stretch. And I can imagine, here, if you are in one of these settings where sometime down through the centuries you get access to this ability, even just for a moment, to see this mysterious image. Um, I forget the Greek term for it, right? But the image not made by human hands, as it
The
shows up in a few places.
Acariopoetus.
Yes,
Acariopoetus. Uh-huh.
and I don't know if I'm looking at that. I don't know that I would be immediately thinking to myself, hey, I wonder if it's a full body image that's
Yeah,
folded behind that. So I guess with some of that, it might be a little difficult, obviously, just from the way it's described in that particular account, to go
right,
one way or the other on it. Like, well, they just say it's a face, so therefore it can't be more. That's got to be
right.
part of the difficulty.
Right. And this is where I think, for instance, the sciences have been helpful in bringing together some of the pieces so that we could, if you could piece together an environmental journey for the cloth,
Mm,
which we have been able to do,
yeah.
if you take the scientific evidence and align it with the historical record, well, now the historical record could begin to take on a little more nuance.
Mm,
Um, because, for instance, we know the cloth was in the Anatolian. We know that it was in the Anatolian Peninsula. We know that it was
hmm.
somewhere near the Straits, going into the Black Sea. So that tells me that it was in Constantinople, and that aligns, of course, with a record we have of the emperor receiving the burial linen of Christ into the
Hmm.
imperial relic inventory in the year 944.
Yep.
So I mean, at that point, we have a point of contact
Right.
between two disciplines and two ways of knowing, two methods
Sure.
of knowing, and so that I think takes on a little more philosophical significance to us. I think the same can be said of what we know of the Fourth Crusade. You know,
Hmm.
we know from an independent historical record, we know well the events that happened, that transpired in Constantinople, 1204 to 1205, when Pope Innocent III was blissfully unaware that Christian crusaders were sacking the city of Constantinople, and when he, of course, when he learns that the city has been sacked, is when he responded with those mass writs of excommunication for everyone he could get the name of, saying that I know you stole relics, I know you looted churches. Unfortunately, he doesn't mention what relics were taken.
Hmm.
But okay, so we can take that with the knowledge that we also have a primary source from a knight who was on that crusade, Robert de Clary,
Hmm.
who tells us that every Friday at the Church of St. Mary de Blacarny, there is an image of our Lord stood straight up for the faithful to venerate. Well, that's it.
Right.
Yeah. So what is he talking about?
Yep.
And so when you
Yep.
begin to line up those historical points of certainty, then we can begin to speculate. And again, it is only
Sure.
speculation, but you approach a greater certitude, I think, the more environmental evidence we can bring to bear. Um, it begins to take on more significance, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Well, and I want to ask you here too. I don't know if this is a good time to do it, but hey, why not? But um, I don't know in terms of your own sort of research or even just research you're aware of in this particular, kind of direction. How much does the art history kind of come into play? Because that's something that I'm increasingly interested in because I feel
Yeah,
like I don't know that I would have thought of that. I mean, I have a BA in history. My undergrad was in history. I've always loved history, but
yeah,
I don't know that in my own education that I remember there being a whole lot of emphasis on some stuff that I now think more and more can be incredibly enlightening from
yeah.
looking at that aspect of it. And I
No,
do
I
find it
think,
interesting that uh, having visited the Holy Land myself, and I've seen firsthand a lot of those very early depictions of Christ where he's so commonly depicted in a more like Romanesque, sometimes even kind of way, right? Clean shaven, and he's the good shepherd, and has the Roman kind of haircut, and then you do see this switch where it's just an image that it's not difficult to say, hey, that looks a lot like the guy on the shroud, for example,
right.
as people do. So,
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. I have long said this that, as a historian who teaches about lots of people of history, I don't know of any artistic depiction of a historical figure that is not informed by someone's description of that person, by contemporary knowledge of what that person looked like. I mean, think about even sculpture of
mhm.
ancient of the Greco-Roman world. I mean,
Yeah,
The features are so distinct that it's not
Yeah,
like they're working from a common mold or model.
right.
Um, and
By the way, I really love those things. Have you seen on YouTube, where they try to
yes,
use AI, or not AI, but they try to use like the modern CGI to recreate what this person would look like on the street. It's really intriguing, to really
yes.
bring them to life like that.
I'm really struck by the one of Octavian Caesar.
Yeah.
Is just that one particular Caesar Augustus really stuck with me.
Yeah.
And so that's my point is that for every single historical figure I could think of, we have something that informed that representation in art. So Jesus is the most depicted person in
Right.
art
In history.
ever, ever, and we have no surviving contemporary description of
Yeah.
him.
Right. He's not
There,
described in the scriptures,
there is
you know.
nothing in the scriptures that describe him,
Yeah.
and so what you made the point that I think is so important. When you began to see Christianity come out of the catacombs after the early fourth century, when the Edict of Milan made Christianity legal throughout the Roman Empire, is when you begin to see this shift. There is now the complete shift, of course, happens in the sixth century with the first Pantocrator image.
Yep. I have it
The
right up
one,
here. I have it on my door too. I love it.
do you the one
Yeah.
that is at St. Catherine's
St.
Monastery in
Catherine's. Hmm.
Mount Sinai. So that's the oldest Pantocrator we have. But if you go to the catacomb, and I'm not sure it's open to the public, but it's the one that is located right next to the excavation of Constantine's villa.
Hmm.
Um, there was a necropolis there,
Okay.
and there is mid fourth century image of Christ that begins to take on these features of a little bit longer hair, and now we have a beard,
Hmm.
and so the transformation is not complete until you see that Pantocrator image of the sixth century, but
Right.
something informed that.
Right.
This is the most depicted person in art in history. And here's what else is so interesting to me about that. We don't tolerate any deviation from the conventional understanding of what he looked like.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the thing. Like, I've heard so many people say, that I was just talking to Dr. Ken Stevenson recently.
Yes, yes,
And he was saying, he goes around and like, in his presentations, there's just, when people checking him in the hotel, whatever. If someone sees something that he has with him that's got the shroud face on it, everybody just says, "Oh, that's Jesus." Or where'd you get that cool picture of Jesus? It's like this ubiquitous kind of,
yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
kind
why
of we sort
is
of
that?
we sort of overlook the profound simplicity of this, don't we? That we could put an image of Jesus in front of any group anywhere in the world, and it's nobody's going to look at it and say, "Who is that?" I
Hmm.
mean, there are conventional artistic standards that have been applied to him since the sixth century, at least since the sixth
Right.
century, and it's based on something, and I find it startling that Pantocrator. Um, sure, maybe there's some theological significance to the swollen cheek. It could also be simply that the artist knew the cheek was swollen.
Yeah, and I'm looking at it now too, because and even little details like the shape of the eyes,
The
which
tripartite hair.
the tripartite, yeah, and the slope of the mustache.
Yes.
Like, why would you make that up? Like, I feel like artists, like, I mean, my tendency is to make things symmetrical,
Right.
even us, like, even when we look at our own face, um, even when, you look at your own face and they do that thing, like sometimes they do that in school, like when you're a kid or wherever, and you do the mirror or something and you see that your face is not as symmetrical as you think
Right.
it is. And it's
Right.
weird to you because you
Yes.
just like, oh, symmetrical. But what, yeah. So why would you specifically do that depicting somebody else when your instinct is to try to make it, symmetrical?
Right.
That just
Right.
seems to me to imply that there was a purpose to that.
Yeah, and I think that when you think about again thinking about method, thinking about epistemology and how we get to knowledge for art, although I am no artistic expert, I do understand it as aesthetically that there would be conventions that one would follow, particularly in representing someone of religious significance. And so I've always been fascinated by this whole question of then what informed it? What informed the first image of him that set the standard that we now don't tolerate. I mean, it's interesting to me that when Michelangelo did his famous Last Judgment painting for the Sistine Chapel altar wall, you'll recall this is the one where he depicts Jesus as kind of the god Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
He's clean shaven and short haired and
Right.
very muscular, and and the reaction against that was profound. I mean, it's one of the biggest discussions at the Council of Trent. So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I do think that we don't tolerate even, I think even people who are not particularly religious
Mm-hmm.
don't seem to aesthetically tolerate alternative depictions of him.
Yeah. And it's neat too because I forget sometimes, we have this vivid. I keep portraits up above my desk here. We have this vivid the Secondo Pio photo
Yes,
negative. I'm forgetting the later photographer's name off the top of my head.
Henriette,
Yeah,
Giuseppe Henriette.
right,
Yes,
Joseph Henry. So, but the seeing that level of detail, I think sometimes we forget that, let's say that the shroud is this Mandylion, is this image of Edessa. If these folks are seeing that image, which they even early on describe as a very faint image, they're not seeing that level of detail, which I think if you're going off of the rather faint original,
right.
you could, to me, makes sense that you could get this variety in terms of interpretation, but you'd still see some of those very prominent features that you can even see in that fainter image.
Well, and I also think that we have to remember that we know today that the linen itself is getting darker. I mean,
Mm,
it's not that the image is going away; it's that the linen fibers are getting darker, and therefore, beginning to obscure. The image
right.
itself looks lighter to
The
our naked
contrast
eye.
is
The
right.
contrast
Yeah.
is, and I suspect, the predictions are right that at some point the image will be absorbed into the surrounding texture, the contrast. But so if we think about that and think that perhaps maybe 1,500 years ago there was more contrast than even to
Mm,
our eye. And
sure.
and and I think that many of the even the medieval engravings that I have seen of ostensions of the Holy Shroud, the first one, 1578, when it arrived in Turin for
Hmm.
Saint Charles Borromeo, is
Right.
commemorated in an engraving that the Savoy family commissioned,
Right.
and that example shows, and all those examples show much more contrast to the image.
Sure.
So I do think it quite possible that what we see and what someone would have seen 1,500 years ago would be quite different.
Sure. Well, and I'm so amazed by, the little details. I mean, this is sort of a little sidebar. I can't, but I always think of just the medical details on it, the little things like is it the which is it the Prey manuscript, or where do we see some of the examples that are put forth as possible depictions of the shroud specifically before its supposed creation in the medieval period, if it's a
Yeah,
hoax, where you specifically see the thumbs withdrawn, you know what I'm talking about, with
right.
that kind of the
So
retracted, that kind of thing.
you're thinking about the Hungarian Prey
Yes.
manuscript.
Yep.
That we know. I mean, that's in the historical record. We know when that was created. It was created in the year 1192,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting that whoever drew that image drew Jesus with four fingers on each hand. Because it's that it depicts that enshroud. The moment of Jesus is enshrouding,
Yes.
and so there's that little detail. And there's also, of course, some have argued that the artist was trying to go for a herringbone weave, a pattern. Certainly, there's some type of zigzag pattern that the
Yeah.
artist was going for. And then there's those four burn holes, the
Yeah.
L-shaped burn holes that you see on the shroud with the naked eye, that this 1192 artist duplicated.
Yeah.
So why would you put a detail like that unless you'd seen the linen? And I want to add
Right.
something to that too, because
Yes,
I
please.
I had the great privilege of of seeing the shroud last July
Oh, wow.
2022. I was part of a small group of people who were there for a special event, and we had some private time with the cloth. And I do have to say although my first reaction was predictably maybe a little bit awestruck or overwhelmed at the encountering this artifact that I've spent so much of my life studying, very closely followed was the reaction I had to its beauty, the
Hmm.
beauty of the linen itself. That herringbone
Hmm.
weave is visible to the naked eye,
Yeah.
and it's startling. It's startling.
Wow.
It's a beautiful cloth, and so it made sense to me that someone would take that away as one of the distinguishing characteristics of his burial linen,
Uh,
if they had seen it in the 12th century, because the
mm-hmm.
herringbone weave is quite obvious.
And is that, and I don't want to misspeak here because I've heard, or I don't want to push it too far, so to speak, but I've not so much, I don't know if it would be accurate to say that that weave itself is evidence of its first century provenance, or if it's more accurate to say that they have discovered, and I'm forgetting the exact expedition, but linen that they found that's similar to it. My understanding is from the Masada
Right, the Masada
excavations and things
area.
like that, or to say that at least from a hard historical standpoint, there's nothing immediately disqualifying about the linen that we have in Turin that would make it for sure not from first century origin.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely nothing
I'm saying it
disqualifies it.
different ways
No,
to
but I actually think that the way
yeah.
you said it there is very appropriate. That nothing disqualifies it as a first century linen. It's hand loomed.
Mm-hmm.
So could it be ancient? Yes. Could it be medieval? Yes. Because the hand looming doesn't change for over 1,000 years, and
Right.
so there's nothing that disqualifies it. I think it intriguing that the complexity of the weave, to my mind, again, speaking as a medieval historian, the complexity of the weave, to my mind, points more to an earlier date.
Hmm.
Just because there's not much market for a linen of this complexity,
Hmm.
this fine a weave of the linen quality that it is. To me, that argues for an older date. And
Would that be, if I can ask here, would that, I don't know if this would make sense, but would that have something to do with, something that is, I don't want to say not being mass produced, but it's something that is not being maybe produced so frequently that you come up with a, kind of relatively easy method like this? Does this show the kind of care and concern that would possibly go into something that is, you're really going to make this count, if that makes
yeah,
sense? I don't know if,
I think what we're dealing with is obviously an expensive linen. It's an unusual linen, and
hmm,
no matter if it's ancient or medieval, it is unusual. And because the simplest way to make a linen, to make a cloth, is a 1/1 weave. It's a simple process. You can for our equivalency mass produce them that way.
right,
Um,
right.
this was something that was done with great care, and complexity. So whoever the weaver was probably did not produce many of these. And you mentioned the Masada samples, I mean, of which I think we have maybe one for sure,
Hmm.
that is a close match to this. I know of no surviving medieval linen like this, um,
That's something I
but
forget. Yeah, I've been wondering about that too.
but you
To
know,
those who just sort of say very dismissively, some like, "Oh, it's just a hoax." Like, well,
yeah.
do you? What cloth evidence do we have? Yeah, so I've wondered about that.
Yeah, there's the whole industry of textiles. As I said, didn't change really for from ancient time to if you want to jump into the age of industrialization. I mean, a
Yeah,
hand loom is a hand loom. It's a very basic,
right.
simple piece of equipment. And it doesn't change. And so, although I'm not a textile expert, and I want your listeners to know that. I have observed, and it really, I think it's something I thought about after I actually saw the shroud with my own eyes. I was surprised at the impression the weave made on me.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know that I expected that.
Yeah.
Um, I would say the third thing I noticed were, the water stains and the blood stains. I took great note of those.
Yeah.
And so that's when, the sort of the academic mind kicks in. But my reaction to the cloth itself as an artifact was initially its beauty as a linen.
Hmm.
And I think maybe we don't talk enough about that.
Yeah, I don't know that I've really heard that before. It's an
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But
Have you encountered? I've had Justin Robinson on a number of times, talking about some different angles here, but some of his work, and I've seen some other work in this realm of, is it new? I always get the word mixed. Numismatic. I'm messing it up. Coin.
numismatics,
Numismatics. Yeah, there it
numismatology.
is.
Yeah,
Numismatology.
numismatics.
That's a fun
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, it's a
That's the
fun word.
that's the one, you win big on Jeopardy with that one.
That's right.
But yeah,
That's
does
right.
that, because again, I'm looking at these different things that would potentially, like if I'm imagining myself out there, like I mentioned earlier that I had a great love of history and studied history, but I sometimes think, like, if I had specifically pursued the academic track of
Yeah.
really dedicating to that, the kinds of things that I would hope that maybe I would be trying to kind of bring into that investigation, or to potentially help me fill that picture out. So is that something that comes up in your own research at all, or that you've taken a look at some of those claims?
I have looked at it. I mean, to be honest, I think the jury is very much out. If you even ask
Hmm.
imaging experts, which I'm not an imaging expert,
Okay.
but relying upon those people who are,
Yeah.
it's a very mixed conversation. And I've heard it described as pareidolia,
Hmm.
that are matrixing, that we're trying to make sense of something as we are wont to do. Our minds want to bring patterns together to make, that's that logos at work, right? We're trying
Yeah.
to make things
Which that's
work.
that's a whole interesting topic in and of itself.
Yeah, and so I've heard that argument, and then I've also heard it argued from people who really invested in this research, that you can make out specific letters, and now we know that there's a certain mintage of this lepton coin where there was a mismark, there was a misprint that
Hmm.
actually aligns with what these particular visible letters are. So
Hmm.
I think it's interesting and it's compelling, but I have to tell you, we touched on this before when we talk about skepticism and talk
Hmm.
about how much evidence is enough evidence.
Right.
I think even if we were to demonstrate that these are true first century leptons that covered the eyes of the man wrapped in this shroud, I mean, if we could make out the words Pontius Pilate,
Right.
on this particular coin, there's always going to be a level of doubt
Hmm.
that that anybody who had access to ancient coins could have done this.
Right.
But it is one of those other aspects that I find intriguing. I just think that I'm not only am I not qualified to pronounce on it, I'm not sure where I stand on it.
Sure. Sure. Well, and it's like, I've heard John Jackson say this in interviews, and it's something that I'm trying to consider a lot myself too. That when you enthusiastically, because there's a lot to be enthusiastic about, of course, and
Yeah,
excited about, but I run into, in sometimes the YouTube comments, or sometimes just some conversations about the shroud. You'll find, from the skeptical side, at least I do, where you might have somebody who's kind of fixated, or kind of attentive to maybe one or two or three particular details. Usually it's one or two. I've found, at least, that they seem to be pinning their entire
right,
skeptical attitude on, or their argument on that. And it might be a really good argument, and it might make me sit back and go, oh yeah, that's like. But I always come back to that reality that, it's the anatomically correct nature of everything about the
yeah,
body. It's the claims about the cloth, or potential matching up with the first century possible provenance of the cloth. It's
right,
the pollen. It's you go down this list increasingly of all the multi dimensional sort of aspects of what leads to these claims that it's authentic. That you really
right,
have to find an argument that accounts for all of that. And
right.
I certainly haven't run into anyone who comes close to even trying to debunk it, on more than like maybe a half dozen. sort of
No,
account.
no,
So,
it's true, and I think that it's like there seems to be a disconnect in the way that we deal with this artifact. And I'm talking about in academia, even about the
hmm,
way that we deal with an artifact like this. It has profound religious implications to it. Um, and the way we deal with other artifacts. If you take an artifact based on one or two characteristics and you throw out all the rest, that's intellectually and academically dishonest.
hmm,
And it's a rubric that the hard sciences and even my discipline of history we apply to everything else we study.
hmm,
But yet, when it comes to this cloth, and I've seen it over and over and over again, that we will not we but others will throw out lots of other evidence to hang an opinion or a conclusion on one or two aspects,
hmm,
throwing out the rest. And as I said, that's intellectually dishonest. And
sure.
and I don't know. This is inexplicable to me, truly. I haven't seen it with other things that have been studied academically that are historical artifacts. So I don't know what that is, but it's you either have to take the sum total of everything and weigh that, or none of it,
Right. Yeah.
and that's truly where we are.
And I was trying to think of an analogy, but in this, but without maybe even having to go to an analogy, I think it might just be for me, like, so for me personally, if and I've said this before, I think on this show at some point, like if it's absolutely conclusively proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, at least for my sort of rational thinking, that the shroud is completely a hoax, it's completely inauthentic, that kind of thing, I would be disappointed, I'd be confused, I'd be maybe upset a little bit, for sure. It would affect me, but my there's no doubt in my mind at all, my faith does not rest on whether or not the Shroud of Turin is authentic. My faith is much deeper than that. Um, but by the same token, I can recognize, I feel like I can recognize and appreciate that if there is somebody who is living, for example, a life antithetical to the gospel,
Right.
and somehow this would go the other way, and it would be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is this miraculous, perhaps, burial shroud of this man who's more than a man,
Right.
then some things might get a little personal. It might come into play.
It's a bigger, yeah,
So
it's a
that's
bigger
something
ask
yeah,
for them. It's a bigger
yeah.
ask for them
And I
than it
try to
is.
appreciate that and respect that, and
Hmm.
because it's not, I don't think it's the same scenario,
Yeah.
per se. So,
No, I think that that's important, an important observation that it is a bigger ask for someone who doesn't. And I would say to you even that while you might not need your faith to rest on that, um, it's an artifact. It's an object, and faith by its own definition doesn't require anything visible,
hmm,
so or tangible or knowable by the senses. And
right.
so that to me is another really fascinating aspect of this cloth, is that it brings those two epistemologies together so perfectly. You have the
Yeah.
demonstration of the sciences at work, the hard academic inquiry as a way of knowing, and you
Hmm.
have the mystery that you ultimately have to confront at the end of the day. And what you do with the mystery, now, see, that's the question. That's the question. Because
Yeah.
I know I've known people that don't like to hear this, but it is a philosophical truth that whenever you are in the presence of something that you do not understand, that the human capacity cannot grasp hold of and work out, you are already in the presence of something greater than yourself. No matter
Hmm.
what you call that thing,
Right.
mystery is
Right.
something that is beyond you.
Yep. And I think this came up in a few different ways recently. And I was thinking about this, the role of, again, faith, and some people don't like that word, but
Right.
I was trying to make the case the other day. I was talking to a friend of mine about, this whole supposed, incompatibility, right, between religion and science, that kind of thing. And I was talking to Dr. Steve Barr about this recently on an episode of my show here
Right.
about the harmony of science and faith. And but to make a long story short, the way I argued it was, and this came up in a high school class setting, actually, was where it finally came up, was I was trying to help them to see that at some point, no matter how much evidence you have, there is some kind of leap of faith where there's this ascent, right? Where, and I think Cardinal Newman writes about this a lot too, but this idea of the ascent of, like you said earlier, what can you really know? How far does that knowledge go?
Right.
In terms of your possession of it? Like, it's not really something you possess. It's you witness it, you
Right.
consider it. You're using your limited intellect to get around something that is outside of yourself, that is other. And
Right.
the example I gave my students, I said, I said, do I have absolute 100% unquestionable certainty, that like my wife won't ever poison me, or I was giving ridiculous examples, and they were kind of laughing. And I said, but do I have really, really good reasons to think she never will?
Right.
What I said?
That's right.
Yes, I have great reason. It's not just a like, well, oh gosh, I can't know this, so I just got to take a leap. No, some leaps
Right.
you can be more confident about some leaps than others,
Right.
But there is always that submission. I feel like is a good word to use there, and that's not a word I think we like in our society too.
Well,
It's a hard sell maybe for
yeah.
some folks.
And certainly we don't like that word when it comes to our intellect or our
Right,
capacity to know something,
right.
because I do think it's a characteristic of modern, well, actually now postmodern man, of course,
Hmm.
is that things are knowable, that things are explainable in rational terms. And we've passed so many generations of this kind of thinking that it's almost in our DNA now.
Hmm.
And it's, to the medieval mind, if I postulated something to a group of medieval pilgrims, this is the burial linen of Christ, they might ask me, by what authority do you say that?
Sure.
Right? By what authority do you say that? But not prove it to me, or
Right,
what is your
right,
evidence? Where is your proof? That is a that's modern postmodern man. And
right.
so the conflict we have between faith and science is really sort of, I would call it kind of a devolution in philosophy, is that
Hmm.
the ancients didn't see these things as incompatible, and
Right,
they birthed philosophy. So
right.
what has modern man done to it?
Yeah.
Um, there's obviously, as I mentioned, the idea of mystery. There's clearly a reality, no matter what you call it. There's clearly a reality that is beyond our knowing with our senses,
Hmm.
and you probably demonstrate this to your students all the time. I mean, you can always use the example of how our senses deceive us all the time.
Oh yeah.
So if everything is dependent upon my sensory inputs and what I can directly observe and know empirically, well, then we're going to be confronted with those conflicts all the time in the natural world.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. I always use the example with my students of a thunderstorm. We hear thunder and we see lightning, and we think those are separate events,
Hmm.
and they're not. But it's because
Right.
our senses process them differently,
Right.
because sound travels at a different speed than light. We understand that they're the same event, but our senses don't tell us that.
Right.
So we're already having, even in the natural phenomenon,
It takes a little bit of homework.
we're already having to appeal, exactly, a little math.
Yeah.
We're already having to appeal to an external method of knowing the natural world to use our senses.
Hmm.
So yeah, I
That's
mean,
a great example. I'm gonna
this
borrow
is a
that one.
whole like wormhole we could go into,
Yeah.
but it's so true. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'll tell, and there's so much great stuff we're covering here. I want to, in our just last couple minutes here, maybe we can back up just to
Sure.
closer to the beginning of the potential timeline, and just maybe focus on
Right.
one aspect of this, but which I want to ask you, because I'm kind of curious about this. I've heard a lot of different things. I might try to bring it up here. I've had some some folks comment when the Mandylion or the Edessa image have been brought up in passing on previous shows. There's been some comments that people have mentioned that I'm gonna get it here quick, that were strange to me, or I didn't know what they were talking about. So I want to focus specifically just on, kind of your take on the King Abgar legend, and for those who maybe don't know this, maybe you can just give a quick rough sketch of how does the shroud, according to this legend, get from Jerusalem to Edessa in the first place, and how do you think that looks in terms of the possible historical reliability with
Yeah.
that?
So the legend is, of course, that that King Abgar, the king of Edessa, was healed from leprosy, and the legend is that it was Saint Jude Thaddeus who
Hmm.
took this cloth to King Abgar, and he was cured. And we know that the legend lives on for centuries because there's that ninth century painting of this
Yeah.
miracle in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai.
Right.
But interestingly, we know that it's a legend that's recorded in a historical record. Eusebius of Caesarea mentions it. So it is a legend that has made it into the early tradition of the church. Again, does that qualify as history? Well, Eusebius of Caesarea wasn't there. He's not the best
Mm.
source, but he's reporting what is an oral tradition.
Right.
So in the rubric of historical method, that's not the greatest testimony, but it's what we have.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting because there is the connection. Then we know that something during the reign of the Emperor Justinian in the early 6th century, about the year 525, that there
Mm-hmm.
was something that was held in the wall of that city that Justinian believed protected it from a plague.
Sure.
And so those two miracle stories seem to share in common an image of Christ.
Right. And an
Um,
image, not
an image not
strictly
made by human
speaking, right?
hands,
Like,
right?
just this is a painting. Like they mentioned that it's something different,
Yeah, it's not made by human hands.
not just something different, right? This is something
Right,
that claims some kind of miraculous origin of some kind.
right.
Okay.
So I think that's super compelling that it shows up in the historical record, even as a
Yeah.
secondary account.
Well, that's because I tend to think too, like, even if it's just a legend about him, I mean, could that legend be not very reliable, or maybe even not even true, but there was something that did
Yeah,
lead them to take the cloth there, to hide it, to whatever the
right.
case is. And that's where some of that potential pollen evidence, can be kind of instructive and interesting to see, where was this thing, where was the shroud.
Yeah. Again, I think
You
that's
know,
why that's why the disciplines working together, informing each
yeah.
other, is so helpful. Because we
Hmm.
do have an environmental journey. We don't have a timeline for that environmental journey,
Right.
but we know where it's been. And I mean
Yeah.
that's the CSI 101. And
Right.
so yeah, I do think that's interesting from a historical perspective, but I find it interesting from sort of the perspective even of maybe this is not really an academic discipline, but if you look at legend and folklore in general, I think this is universally true across cultures that there's some condition in a culture that produces a story or a legend, and where that originates might not be in the historical record, but the fact that there is the legend tells us that there was a point of origin,
Hmm.
whatever that was, whatever informed that. And
Right.
so the fact that we have the story of the healing of King Abgar, and we have the story of an image not made by human hands that saved the city of Edessa from the plague. I mean, is that a coincidence?
Hmm.
I don't think so. I mean, there's some
Yeah.
point of cultural connectivity that we just can't, again, know with a
Can't
method.
put your finger on, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I hate to run here, but I
No, but
think
I know.
for now, yeah, I think. Well, let me
Yes,
just
for
ask you
now.
here, and I'm sure we'll catch up again in the future too, because there's so much to
Okay.
unpack. But let me just ask you, maybe in closing, what are you working on now? What's next? Shroud related. What's coming up?
A lot of really exciting things going on in shroud studies right now, of course, and I'm working with a group, actually an international group, 12 different people coming together to create a National Shroud of Turin exhibit, which I'm sure you've probably heard about.
Yeah.
That's an initiative that involves a few people I'm sure you know, Joe Marino,
Hmm.
Russ Brialt,
Yeah.
Myra Adams, Nora Creech, Lisa
I haven't
Rowan.
talked to Myra yet. I got to
Yeah,
catch up with her at some point. Yeah.
some great people are working together
Yeah.
on that to make that a reality, and there's really a profound interest in this in youth organizations. I think World Youth Day, we will have a
Hmm.
presence there for doing some educational sessions.
Neat.
National Eucharistic Congress next summer will be very shroud
Okay.
centric. So lots
Wonderful.
of initiatives, lots of educational initiatives, but my research
Yeah.
really continues on that 13th century. I really am sort of narrowed in on looking at the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade,
Sure.
because I'm sort of chasing the hypothesis that it disappeared from Constantinople
Hmm.
uh, at the end of the Fourth Crusade.
Well,
So
and just because nobody's found a record of it yet doesn't mean it's not in some,
doesn't mean
chest
it's
in a
not there.
castle, and like, right. I
It
mean,
doesn't
it's,
mean it's not there, and I'm going to be the historian to
yeah.
discover it. But I will tell you the other thing
Well, I
that
mean, take a look at my attic. I mean, no, it's like, no, like every one of us has a crawl space somewhere that's
that's
like
right.
this, and that's just your house. So, like, talk about centuries. Who knows?
That's right. But the other thing, of course, that academically interests me, and you can tell from the way the two interviews that you and I have done, you know this, is that I really want to write the philosophical book on the shroud.
Hmm.
I want to be able to take every single piece of evidence that's been obtained, either by any academic discipline, and to look at that from that perspective of certitude of knowledge and how we've
Yeah.
reached that point. Because I think the overarching idea here again is that there is a mystery at work. National Geographic called this the greatest enigma of history, or I'm
Hmm.
paraphrasing, but something like that. I mean, for an international media outlet to say something like that, I think is quite profound.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
is. It's an enigma, and so really getting to the heart of what we mean by that,
Right.
and when will we ever reach the level of certitude about what it is? What will it
Hmm.
take? So,
We'll see.
yeah, that's right. All
Well,
right. Well, thank you
Dr.
for this,
Cheryl White,
Mike.
yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and I can't wait to catch up again in the hopefully
Good.
not too distant future. So, best wishes to you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. God bless.
Okay. You too. Bye bye.
Now, if you're a history nerd like me, that was just edge of your seat stuff there for a lot of that interview. And I've always been very interested in history. It was my major in college, and it really, comes in handy and very much helps to sort of frame a lot of my own interest in the shroud, I think. So this kind of conversation for me is particularly fascinating, a lot of fun to bring to you today. So feel free to investigate further, check out some of the links we've got below. And as always, until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.